Know ye not that to whom ye yield yourselves servants to obey, his servants ye are, to whom ye obey, whether to sin unto death or of obedience unto righteousness? How you doing with the call to obedience? You doing what God calls you to do? Are you loving him by keeping his commandments? Are you honoring him by the way you live your life? Or are you kind of doing your own thing? It's amazing to me how we can be spiritual about things that don't affect us. But as soon as it's something that interferes with our lifestyle, things change. All of a sudden, you know, the old saying, he's gone from preaching to meddling. All of a sudden, things change. All of a sudden, things get different. How's your call to obedience? Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 5, it says, by whom we have received grace and apostleship, for obedience to the faith among all nations, for his name, among whom ye also are ye also the called of Jesus Christ. We've received the grace to be obedient. Most of the time, if I ask what the definition of grace is, we say it's God's unmerited favor. And that's true. We think about it in terms of salvation. But you know that God's grace also extends to how we live our lives? And when I start talking about, well, you know, I just can't get victory over this sin, or I can't get victory over this area of my life, or I can't accomplish anything in this area of my life. Do you know that God's already given you the grace to accomplish that? To have victory over that sin, that stronghold that Dr. Lilly talked about? He's already given you the grace to do it. You haven't availed yourself of that grace. You haven't put your faith and trust in God to give you victory over those things. Call of obedience. If we go back to Jonah chapter 3, Jonah answers the call. And the word of the Lord came to Jonah a second time, saying, arise, go unto Nineveh, that great city, and preach unto it the preaching that I bid thee. So Jonah arose and went unto Nineveh according to the word of the Lord. Now Nineveh was an exceeding great city of 3 days' journey. And Jonah began to enter into the city a day's journey. Now, 3 days' journey doesn't mean it took him 3 days to get there from the time Jonah spit him out on the land. It means that to cover all of Nineveh, it would take him 3 days of walking around to cover all of the city. So he goes in 1 day's journey, a third of the way into the city, and he preaches what God tells him to preach. And Jonah began to enter into the city a day's journey, and he cried and said, yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. Can you imagine if we had a revival meeting and that's all the preacher preached? 40 days and Lighthouse Baptist Church is going to be overthrown. 40 days and Newcastle County is going to be overthrown. That's all he said. That was the extent of the message. Well, we'd all get home real early each night, wouldn't we? That's what he preached. Did he do it with the right attitude? Well, we'll see in chapter 4 that he didn't, but he preached. He proclaimed the message that God told him to proclaim. And what happened? Verse 5. So the people of Nineveh believed God and proclaimed a fast and put on sackcloth from the greatest even unto the least of them. For word came unto the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, and he laid his robe from him, and covered himself in sackcloth and sat in ashes. Can you imagine? A man that didn't want to be there, didn't want to deliver the message that he had to deliver, had to go through the fish's belly to get there, and he comes into the city and only covers a third of the city, and the word spreads so quick that the entire city is in repentance. You know what that tells me? God doesn't need us. God doesn't need any one of us. God chooses to work through us and chooses to use us, but he doesn't need us. And he chose Jonah, and he called Jonah, and he made sure Jonah went. And Jonah proclaimed the message that he had wanted Jonah to proclaim. And the entire city repented in sackcloth and ashes. Can you imagine? The world's worst missionary with the world's greatest results. But isn't that the way God works? You know, I'm working with the guys through the book of Ephesians down on Wednesday nights. And we've been working through it, and I've studied Ephesians, and I've taught Ephesians, and I've gone through it. But I got thinking through it this time as I was looking at Ephesians. You know, Paul writes that God's chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and the weak things to confound those things that are mighty. That's why I'm up here tonight. I'm a perfect example of that. But Paul, who was Paul? Man, he had spent his entire life studying the Scriptures. He knew everything about the Scriptures. He was well educated. He was a good talker. He was all of those things. And God called him, and I said, well, you know, that's not so bad. God, you know, Paul had all that training already. He was a Pharisee. He had all that training. But if you had all that training as a Pharisee, where would be, in man's thinking, the logical place to send Paul? Who would he be the best one to be sent to? What group of people? The Jews. He knew it. Man, he could argue with them up one side, down the other, and foul them all up. So what does God do with this well-educated Pharisee and the Jews? He sends him to the Gentiles. Can you imagine? Because God's not going to let any man take the glory for himself. He's going to do things different than we think the things should be done every time. And he takes this man Jonah, and this man Jonah doesn't want to go because he's a nationalist. He loves his country, Israel, and he doesn't want to see them have to deal with this foreign country. And God takes him and says, you take the gospel where I tell you to take the gospel. And you preach the message that I tell you to preach. And he does it. And the entire city repents. The call to proclamation. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15. Doesn't it challenge us that we should always be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within us? Do we do that? Are we ready when somebody challenges us? When somebody asks us a question? Have we studied this book enough to know how to answer? One of the things that I've seen in the ministry more than anything else is that people don't spend time in this book. And Dr. Lilly hit it last night with prayer. We don't pray. And there's a powerful, powerful blessing that comes from prayer. But we don't study this book. And we don't hide this book in our hearts. We don't put it away so that it can be used. I don't know if I've used this illustration before, and if I have, just act like I haven't. Where's Rich? There he is back there in the back, asleep. Hey, Rich, how you doing tonight? Now, on Sunday, we had some conversation that Rich was a Marine. Now, when you joined the Marine Corps, they sent you off to boot camp, didn't they? And while you, see, he's afraid to answer me. He doesn't know what I'm going to do. I may not know what I'm going to do. And when you got to boot camp, you didn't need any of your own clothes, did you? They gave you everything you needed and much more. And along with all those clothes that may not have fit so well, they gave you something else. They gave you something and they said, this is your best friend and you're going to keep it with you no matter what. It's going to be by your side day and night, 24 hours, 7 days a week. What was that? You didn't get a rifle till man, and you're not even supposed to call it a rifle, are you? I thought you were supposed to call it a weapon. Well, when you got that rifle in the last 2 weeks, this is why I would never be a Marine. When you got that rifle, you learned all about that rifle, didn't you? You know how to take it apart and put it back together again? Blindfolded, in a dark room, upside